Okay, well, good afternoon. What a great introduction. You actually gave the first part of my presentation for me, I think, Jeffrey. So let me just go to this slide. For those of you that don't know, this is our mission statement from HeartMath. I know a lot of you are probably familiar somewhat, or have heard of us or something. But we started out, 30 years ago, really about alignment. How do we help people align their heart, mind, and emotions? And one of our perspectives is, and actually a fair amount of scientific support for this now, is that the human heart is more than a pump. That the great poets and religions and philosophers have been right all along. That there really is, it's that saying, is an energetic heart. That is the main doorway to what we can call our higher self, spirit, soul. We just call it our larger self. But it's accessing that and that information, which we call intuition. That is what lifts consciousness. So that's kind of my whole talk. Goodbye. No, not really. But so we've developed a number of tools and techniques to really facilitate that process. And that's what it's been about all along, is how do we facilitate people connecting with what they already own, what you already have inside. So I'm not going to read, I don't read slides very well, but you can get our mission statement there. So to kind of chunk that down, the research has always been in three main categories. Personal, which Jeffrey mentioned. How do we increase our personal coherence? How do we perform better, feel better, live more healthful, fulfilling lives at the personal level? And that's what a lot of our tools, techniques, and programs for the last close to 30 years have been about. Our current focus is on social coherence, so I'm going to cover a little bit more today. And just a little bit of tidbit on the global coherence, which is a project called the Global Coherence Initiative, if you're not familiar with that. It's about, 10 years old now. I'll just give you a little taste of that as well. So we can talk about coherence in a lot of ways. In most dictionaries, coherence, if you look it up, it talks about the quality of somebody's speech. In other words, am I able to put my words together into a coherent sentence, right? And if I had a little bit too much to drink before I came on stage, and uttering nonsense, I would be, incoherent, right? But in physics, it has a similar meaning, but it really means how connected, correlated, coordinated, harmonious is the activity among systems and subsystems. So it always implies that things are connected and working together in a harmonious way. It always implies energy efficiency and these types of things. That's why we chose this term so many years ago after years of debate. So physiologically, coherence reflects how ordered and stable are the various systems in my body or any living system really working together. And as it turns out, as Jeffrey mentioned, we've looked at all the three-letter acronym things that you can possibly look at, EEGs and EMGs and all that it turns out that the heart, and particularly the heart rhythm, gives us our best window into that global coherence within a living system. So personal coherence, we can measure and talk about that in terms of our heart rhythms. This is what heart rhythms look like. These two graphs are from the same person. So the chaotic, jagged-looking one is when this person is actually feeling things like frustration, irritation, anxiety, worry, and so on, right? And as it turns out, those different emotions have slightly different signatures, patterns in the rhythm. And today, we can, machine learning and so on, with about 75% accuracy, you can tell somebody's discrete emotional state just from the heart rhythm. Okay, now as it turns out, the graph on the right, your right, called coherence, is what we call a coherent heart rhythm. And this is the rhythm that our hearts naturally beat out when we're actually feeling things like appreciation, gratitude, kindness, compassion, and so on. That's how we originally discovered this so many years ago, was actually just looking at what all those different physiological signals are during different emotions. And at that time, I think there were maybe 3 studies in the medical literature on positive emotions. Things have changed, right? But literally, nobody cared about, looked about. It was all about stress and anxiety, hundreds, thousands of publications, but very little on what happens when you feel gratitude or appreciation or compassion and so on. But anyway, it turns out that our heart is the main thing that shifts into a different state, a different rhythm, as it turns out, we now call coherence. And 300 studies later, we just hit the 300 mark of 300 independent published studies now using coherence training in a vast variety of different applications, whether it's lowered blood pressure, improved hormones, better test scores, et cetera, have verified that this is really an optimal state. And as it turns out, the brain is the big winner. And what I'm about to tell you has actually been known since the late 1800s, largely forgotten and ignored. But the heart literally sends more information through our nervous system to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. And the quality of those neural signals profoundly affects brain function. In fact, it actually, to a large degree, informs the brain about what the body is feeling. So, long story short, we call it a bottom-up process. You can try and have mind on mind to manage itself, or we can go in through the heart, shift the rhythm of the heart, and have a very quick and dramatic shift in brain function. Make sense? Instead of top-down, bottom-up, that's a whole talk in its own, but just give you some tidbits. So the neural pathways of all this are well worked out now. It took a long time, and we know all the mechanisms of how all this works, which I won't go into now. But so these are just some of the outcomes by getting ourselves into a more heart-coherent state. And in fact, I think the most important one is the first one on there, increased capacity or ability to self-regulate. In other words, to maintain our own composure, but especially when the blank's hitting the fan, right? Because it's easy to be in charge of ourselves and self-regulated when all the traffic lights are green and the parking angel's out, my wife says, right? But it's when we hit the traffic jams, literally and figuratively, that we tend to lose it. We fail to self-regulate, and we make sometimes choices that aren't in our best interest or the best interest of others. So it's really that alignment, that capacity to self-regulate from a deeper inner intelligence that we're really talking about. Anyway, faster reaction times, so heart math now. Coherence training, I should say, is used in athletics. We're doing a lot of work now, I'm honored to say, actually, in law enforcement. So teaching police officers how to really maintain their coherence, their composure in those pretty challenging times that they run into, right? Ability to learn, better memory, short and long-term memory. Large study in schools showed that if we teach children how to get coherent, self-regulate, it actually predicts their future test scores. So there's been a lot of research around this. Let's solve the personal side. So we were teaching people these techniques, how to get coherent and stuff for years, and then figured out that we can use technology to facilitate that. That's what Jeffrey, I think, was referring to in his introduction. So the freeze framer was the name of that first product many years ago, now called M-Wave and Interbalance. That was really, as far as I know, the first really viable, inexpensive consumer device that gave people real-time feedback on their heart, their coherence, but how they shift into this optimal state. So they use this to practice the techniques that you could actually use in real life. So it was never about walking around with a device, am I coherent, right? But it's about learning the skill, what it feels like to facilitate those skills. So this is the professional device used by health professionals, schools, and things all around the world now. The mobile version is called Interbalance. A lot of you probably have them that are here. But it tracks your progress and does all the kind of things you would want a mobile device to do. But it's really, again, to help you learn to better self-regulate, to maintain your composure, align with that deeper part of who you really are. So social coherence is, because we're never going to achieve global coherence without going through the step of social coherence. We have to finally learn how to get along. And I really appreciated Joe's presentation. I don't have to go through, kind of obvious, all the problems we have and the stress. And I interviewed many, many people, and from CEOs of corporations to school principals to people doing community programs about what their needs were, the next step. And all of them had different stories, different words, but they all were saying the same thing. People just can't get along. Right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. So that's what social coherence is really about. So our definition here is at a kind of a high level. So social coherence, it relates to the network of relationships which exist among individuals who share common interests, goals, objectives, and so on. And if we're coherent, if a group is coherent, it's reflected in a stable, harmonious alignment of these relationships, which allows for efficient flow of energy and communication, and I'd say actually non-local communication there for a reason, so that we can have collective action, do something together in a constructive way. And as it turns out, this requires the team members to be emotionally aligned. As it turns out, emotion is the big key to all this, and the energy organized by the group as a whole. So this, our last year and a half, 2 years of work and research, has really been on what we call the Social Coherence Initiative. It has three main aspects. One is the development of a new technology platform that assesses a group's coherence level and degree of synchronization between the different pairs within a group. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that, and that turns out to be a fairly important thing. New games that are controlled by the group's coherence and synchronization. And I think one of the most important parts is developing new training programs, new techniques, processes, and so on for helping people achieve and sustain group coherence. And how do we actually get along better? Tools and techniques for that. So we'll be creating e-learning programs for both adults and children. And then, so we have all these great hypotheses and things. We have to measure it. So we've also been developing a new psychometric instrument to measure group coherence. So the first, a couple people have already told me they were at Burning Man this year, and this was our favorite event and so on. The first public demonstration or application of the Social Coherence Technology Platform was at Burning Man by Pablo Vargas. I'll give a couple pictures to show the scale of this thing as they were building it. Kind of amazing. And here's next, I'll show a short 1.5-minute video.
Interactive light and sound sculpture powered by your collective heart energy. In this experience, you will each use your breath to enter a state of coherence or deep harmony with yourself, one another, and the universe. Please connect the heart math sensor to your earlobe. The sensor will measure your individual heart rhythms to determine your collective state of coherence. The deeper your state of collective coherence, the brighter I shine. Let's begin. This is the power of the collective heart.
Cool, huh? So if you're interested, there's a very scaled down version in the exhibit just past the registration. So there's a 6-station hookup if any of you would actually like to try your group coherence. So there's a very small light system there that your group coherence will control. So a couple of the engineers that have been developing the system are actually there to help take you through the experience. So that'll be here the rest of the day and tomorrow. And it's best to do it as a group. So maybe if you can kind of, if you want to do it, go experience that. And they'll actually walk you through a technique that helps you get into coherence and lift the field environment. I invite you to go try it out. So group member synchronization is next. Why do we care about this anyway? So as it turns out, there's a rather amazing and surprising, robustly literature on synchronization. So when people are successfully communicating, there's a good flow of interaction, many types of synchronizations going on. So a lot of you have probably heard about or read magazine articles and things about our body language starts to synchronize and the tones of our voice and these types of things. And that's all important. And as it turns out, it's predictive of the quality of communication. Did we hear each other or not? The synchronization. So But there's also a deeper level of synchronization that occurs that's even more important, as it turns out, and that's synchronization of our physiology. So we can look at lots of different things, like brainwave type things synchronizing, kind of complicated, but also the heart, specifically the heart rhythms. And one of the things that I learned that's worthy of mention is that there's been a fair amount of work looking at mothers and babies. And as it turns out, mothers and babies' heart rhythms synchronize when they're interacting. And that lays the groundwork for future social interaction and self-regulation. And if that synchronization between the hearts of moms and babies doesn't occur, guess what? That child grows up to not be able to socially engage and have good self-regulation. So these research, it's been going on for years. I had no idea. I just recently learned about it when we got into this, how important that fundamental synchronization of the hearts between moms and their children are. So it's the foundation for the rest of our life, in fact. Anyway, so when we facilitate people becoming more synchronized, that actually facilitates things like trust, rapport, prosocial behaviors, in terms of physiological synchronization. So it's a fairly important thing I think we want to facilitate, both in teaching people techniques how to do it, but just like with the M-Wave devices that I showed you that we know now facilitates people learning how to better self-regulate, why not use it at the group level to facilitate social and group synchronization and harmony? Make sense? Kind of a hypothesis, I think, that makes sense. So for this to happen, for synchronization to occur between people, there has to be some type of signal communicated between them. Like, voice and posture, that's pretty easy to understand. We can see them, we can hear them, right? But for things like hearts and brains to synchronize, something else must be occurring. And what I'm going to suggest is that it's actually fields, magnetic fields in particular. And hopefully I'll have time to show you how that's actually occurring, not only between us, but between us and the earth itself. So kind of a good experience of what group synchronization is like. If you're into sports, right, and you've watched a certain team that suddenly something shifts and they're performing at a level that's just beyond their normal capacity. You know what I'm talking about? It's like they're communicating in some energetic, unseen way. Or a concert. Same thing can happen. In the case of a concert, it's like the whole audience is even lifted when that happens. They're all involved as a wholeness. Most of you have the experience what I'm talking about sometime or other? Yeah, good. So there's a fair amount of work on this as well that is suggesting that some type of field connects the members of groups. If they like each other, if they're emotionally bonded, that's a critical part of this. Again, study after study, it shows that it's the emotional connection between pairs or between groups of people that is the key to this deeper synchronization and sharing of this non-local information. So I'm going to not go into a lot of research here, but there's just a surprising amount. I don't have time to go through all those kinds of studies. So we've actually been, for a few years now, doing studies to look at, is this possible, or is this some new age nonsense, or is it really possible? And as it turns out, every time the heart beats, we put electrodes across the body, we're measuring current flow. But basic physics, whenever you have a flow of current, you create a magnetic field, right? So the magnetic field produced by the heart, it actually is the shape shown on this slide. It is a toroidal shape, it literally is. And with today's devices, to measure it, you have to use a device called a magnetometer, right, which is different than the electrocardiogram. But we can measure the ECG, the electrocardiogram, the magnetic field of the heart about 3 feet from the body with today's equipment. It doesn't stop at 3 feet. That's the sensitivity of the equipment. A few years back, it was more like 2 feet, So we know that when we're in a more heart rhythm coherent state, that the magnetic field also becomes more coherent. I've got to hide it myself, the electrocardiogram, the current flow. So we are all in each other's fields now, right? And if we measure the magnetic field and do spectral analysis, I used to work at Motorola many years ago in another life, using almost exactly the same tools we would use there to demodulate or to look at the information being carried by a magnetic field. That's what our cell phones do, right? How does our cell phone talk to the tower? We're using a magnetic field to carry the information, your voice, the text, the picture, whatever. Just saying, we do the same thing. And we can use almost the same tools I would use on a cell phone or a two-way radio to see that the information being carried by the magnetic field of the heart is quite different depending on the emotional state we're in. See the graphs? So anger, appreciation, right? Just to give you an example here. So we can actually measure this now. And this is, I think, a really neat little study here, an important one that was done. It's a PhD dissertation study. And this is 40 people, and they were divided into groups of 4, sitting around a table, kind of like we would have around the conference here, all wired up. 3 of the people were trained how to shift into this heart coherent state about 2 weeks before the experiment, so they're not big lifetime experts or anything. And then the 4th person was naive. They didn't know what the experiment was really about. It was a fairly well thought out protocol. I won't go through all the details, but the main point of it is when the 3 people who had been trained how to shift into coherence randomly shifted into this coherent state, in and out over this complicated protocol, what do you think happened to the 4th person who didn't know what was going on? See if you can read slides, right? They became more coherent. So in other words, that field environment of being coherent lifted the other person in a measurable, physiologically measurable way. Then they also looked at the synchronization across all the pairs and found that, indeed, there was actual heart synchronization going on between, kind of bounced around across all these groups that had its own rhythm, right? That's a whole other, which was also significantly related to how well they liked each other, right? So the people that were more reported having some type of connection with each other emotionally had a higher ratio of becoming synchronized. Again, that's consistent across lots of studies. Now, this is some data recorded from the new platform we've developed. And it's preliminary. This isn't published yet, and it's very preliminary. But what this is indicating is really interesting. So what you're seeing here is in each one of the time domain traces, the stuff on the left, these are 2 people's heart rhythms. You actually see the actual rhythms. And then on the right are the power spectrums, which shows us the frequencies of those rhythms. Now, we can have people do heart meditations. We call them heart lock-ins. And where you have the group say, we're going to send heart and love and care to the planetary field environment. I'll talk about that more in a minute. They get coherent, but you don't necessarily see them come into the same degree of synchronization with each other as you do when you say, okay, I want you and I'm going to send love and appreciation to you, and you're going to send it to me, and you're going to send it to each other, and right? That's what's going on here. So you actually see here an amazing synchronization of their frequencies, the rhythms. Can you see that on the slides? The different pairs kind of line up. Now, we didn't really cheat, but this is a group of people who are pretty familiar with this heart lock-in technique and being able to sustain coherence. This is exactly what we want to teach other groups how to do. And there's already some preliminary data from companies that suggest this is pretty amazing and transformational when we teach people how to do that. Here's another application of being able to use this in a real-world context. This is a group of people having a business meeting. And one of the things we teach in our training is to prep for the meet. We call it prepping. And one of the techniques for that is called shift and lift. Shift to the heart, get coherent, and lift the field environment of the group. So you see the groups on the left side, while they're doing the shift and lift technique, are getting coherent. So we know from many studies that there's a carryover effect of that. In other words, when we get synchronized and aligned before we have a meeting or we perform an activity, well, guess what happens in these kind of meetings? They go better. In fact, some of the companies, one of the funny people, when I say this, say, well, I'll buy this just for that. Their meetings are cut in half. The time, in other words, they listen to each other better. You don't have all the squabbling and the grandstanding going on to the same degree. So, it's a simple thing. Take a minute or two, get coherent as a group, before you do stuff like meetings or athletic events and so on. Now, of course, we can also, with monitoring people in the group, can kind of look at the interactional dynamics that are going on as well. So I might say something if you were all hooked up that you didn't like, and so you can kind of see, uh-oh. So, person B is not liking person A very well. I start looking at these interactions. In fact, one of the studies that was done, preliminary studies, did exactly that. Saying, okay, whenever so-and-so talks, you tend to react. What's going on between you two? And then offline, work that out, right? So we can kind of get that. Which takes me to some of so there's the training program we're developing. There's very practical things that we can do to create more group coherence. So some of the things we know we have to do in the training is clearing histories is one. Does that kind of truly make sense what I mean by that, clearing histories? For people we work with a lot, live with maybe a long time, they do something that we sort of log in our brain, then they do it again, suddenly that's who they are, and they even look like they're going to do that, and there comes that whole baggage of all those histories and an overreaction for what they actually did, right? So, got to clear some histories, often in most groups. Appreciating differences, another aspect of the training program. And learning how to coherently communicate, especially when we learn how to listen from a heart coherent space. It's amazing what goes on in terms of the facilitation of communication and actually hearing people and understanding. I don't mean just hearing the words. Great. Anyway, you got to get the idea, understanding the field environments and so on. Power of collective intuition. So it turns out we've also done a number of studies on intuition and actually shown it's a very real thing in a number of different ways, but I'm not going into that. But when you do it in a group, you actually enhance the intuitive effects. So when we work together in a synchronized group, you actually do have a lift of being able to solve problems and come up with creative solutions, for example. So a lot of expected outcomes. Some of these we already know they're more than expected, but increased positive energy and bonding among group members, more kindness, more caring in our interactions. I kind of already said this, but enhanced collective intuition and problem solving, shorter meeting times, and so on. Fewer mistakes and errors. As Joe pointed out, 91% of mistakes are human errors, and 80-some% of those trace back to problems in communication as well. So let's wrap up by taking this a little bit on the global side, the global coherence. So the Global Coherence Initiative, if you're not familiar with it, is a science-based, very, very co-collaborative. We have collaborators around the world to unite people in heart-focused care and intention to really help facilitate the planetary shift in consciousness from instability and discord to more balance, cooperation, and enduring peace. So I don't have time to really go into this, but one of the things we're doing to do research, we have to measure things. So we're installing a global network of ultra-sensitive magnetometers around the Earth. So we've got these things in places like Lithuania now, Saudi Arabia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, here one in California at our place over in Boulder Creek, and I'm probably forgetting some. But these are designed to measure the resonant frequencies in the Earth's magnetic systems. One of those I'm just going to show you a picture of. These are some new satellite data. It's really cool. We're actually able to visualize the ringing of the geomagnetic field. So as it turns out, we all know we have a geomagnetic field, the thing our compasses tune into, right? Remember back in science class when you got to dump iron filings on a glass plate and you put a magnet under it, they all magically line up in lines. Lines, right? It's called flux lines. They're real things. So think of those lines, only in this case around the planet, as guitar strings. So they really do act like that. So when the solar wind rushes by, it plucks the strings and they vibrate. And that's what you're seeing visualized here from these satellites. So the little dot in the center, the little blue dot is Earth. Right, so you're seeing the actual picture of the real, this is not an artist thing, this is actual real data. Okay? Now, as it turns out, when we measured those frequencies, they're called field line resonances here on Earth, one of the primary resonant frequencies is what's called 0.1 hertz. I might be 1 minute late, but Anyway, that happens to be the exact same frequency. My clicker is not working anymore. Let's see, there we go, of the coherent heart rhythm. So in other words, the resonant frequency of the magnetic field of Earth is exactly the same as the coherent human heart rhythm. And we're coherent when we're in a more loving, caring, compassionate state, which means we can couple more to that. So as it turns out, we've been doing a lot of long-term studies where people wear recorders to record their heart rate variability over weeks and months. And lo and behold, totally shocking to us, the first study, when we found that people's heart rhythms were synchronizing even though they were in radically different locations. Southern California, Northern California, and so on. And what turns out explaining this is because they're synchronizing to the rhythms in the Earth's field. So we're far more interconnected than we normally felt. Now, we replicated this on a much larger study, 100 people in 5 countries, and showing this is actually happening globally. Now, the kind of latest cool finding, this is the one thing that's in the process of being published now, is when they had these 5 groups of 20 people, 5 of them around the world. In the middle of the study, they came together, or didn't come together, but at the same time, used this heart-based meditation called the heart lock-in for 15 minutes together. And this is what the group in one of the groups, they all had the same result. So you see the individuals, the blue lines on the right, are the degree of synchronization they had with each other in the Earth's fields. The graph on the right side is the same thing the day of and the day after they did that heart lock-in. So what we see here is a 15-minute exercise of really getting ourselves coherent personally, literally increases the synchronization with those in our group and the Earth itself. And that has a fairly long carryover effect. It actually has a meaningful thing. So, last slide. It's really our purpose and our hope here that this new technology and training is really going to help decrease social discord and increase positive emotional connections, kindness and cooperation, social well-being, and a sense of collective purpose, hopefully on a global scale. So our next step is to take what we've developed now in terms of the technology platform into a mobile platform. So if there's anybody here that would like to help with that step, let me know. Thank you so much for your attention and patience.